So the first person that I want to focus on, her name is Megan. Her pseudonym is Megan. So at the time, she was 23, and she was in a long-term monogamous relationship. And she describes her kinkiness as feminist, okay? And she does this because she has an understanding that the core themes between the kink community and the feminist community are actually very, very similar. And she said that those sort of three key themes or three pillars are choice, communication, and consent, okay? So she says, and I realize this is a long quote, but bear with me. She says, "I was quite happy to find that the kink community very much stands beside those standards of choice, communication, and consent." She says, "I think partly because what kinksters do would be cruel or wrong otherwise." So they need to have this sort of strong moral code, right, of choice, communication, and consent. She says, "I think that feminism did promote me to be a strong communicator from the start, even when I didn't necessarily know all those C's came with kink." So do you see what I mean? She sees how they overlap so very clearly in her mind, to the point where she believes and understands that her choice to practice BDSM is a feminist choice, right? It's a feminist informed choice because their values and principles are very, very similar. So what Megan really believes is that, in the context of her trusting relationship, she says, like when you are bound or blindfolded or, whatever, you still know you are safe. And this is really important. She says, the person may hurt you, but they're not harming you. Okay. I think that's really, really interesting. And I kind of asked her, like, okay, can you just like run me through a scene where those three principles come into play? Because I just wanted to see how that played out, if you will. And so this is how she describes it. Andrew, again, pseudonym. She says, "Andrew checked in to make sure everything was okay. Communication. And I waved him on, telling him to continue. Consent. It's at these times when I don't particularly envy him as a top, right? Or the dominant partner." She says, because, hey, I'm his partner, and suddenly I'm sobbing as he's beating me. That's her choice. She says that has got to F with your brain a bit. So she very much recognizes that this exchange of power has a physical and emotional impact on both her and her partner, but the importance and the continued negotiation of those three words, communication, consent, and choice, effectively allow her to be comfortable and confident, another couple C words, to engage with these desires in the context of her sexual encounters. I also think it's worth noting in this quote that I just read you, she describes Andrew as a top. She preferred to describe herself as a bottom rather than saying she was a submissive. So, and I asked her to explain that, and she said, "I prefer the term bottom because, submission is too closely linked to, in her opinion, an understanding that implies being passive." And she says, when I'm being a bottom, there is nothing passive about that choice, right? So bear that in mind. And I think that was something similar was reiterated in the short documentary that I got you to watch in the previous lesson. So overall, Megan's understandings of feminism supports her desires for for pain as a form of sexual pleasure. So to wrap up this slide, I've said for Megan, kink is about the capacity to realize her own interests, right? Her own sexual desires against the sort of weight of customs and traditions or other obstacles that tell her, a woman, a feminist, shouldn't be passive or submissive or the receiver of pain inflicted by a man. So again, like, you might sort of respond to this as you feel confused about it, right? But I think what's important is, like, for Megan's own experience, She firmly believes that these communities are built on the exact same pillars, and as a result, her understanding of feminism supports her desires for kink, and her desires for kink are supported and informed by her understandings of feminism. Now, is it always that easy, or was it always that easy with the women that I spoke to? Absolutely not. Danielle, again, not her real name, she was 29 at the time that I spoke with her. And she said, as the title of the slide indicates, she really felt like she had to justify her desire to be submissive, to be on the receiving end of pain as a form of pleasure. Because, she said, feminism messed with me a little bit. She said, I had problems doing anything sexual that could be seen as slightly unequal in terms of power. So she very much acknowledged that her choice to be submissive was like a really long process of a dialogue with herself, right? And as she's sort of said to me, you know, it was a long dialogue that sometimes felt like a clash between my feminist values and aspiring feminist self, and then what objectively turns me on. She says, no matter what the representation of something and the symbolic meaning of it in society, what happened between us in the intimate sphere of sexuality was all right, as long as we both enjoyed it. Okay, so she acknowledges that the choice to be submissive could be problematic or has been problematic in the past in aligning with some of her feminist ideals. But, you know, she has become, through, as she says, a very long dialogue with herself, so critically aware of her own sexual desires that she has reconciled what she originally felt was a clash, right? So she originally felt like she had to justify her desires and really wrestle with those internally. But through, again, in understanding that, you know, what happened between her and her partner, if it was consensual, if they were both enjoying it, then it was fine. Then it does not matter what anyone else says about it, okay? So I bring that up to say that Danielle was one of many participants who went through this sort of like long process of reconciling their sort of feminist beliefs and values with their desire to be submissive and to be on the receiving end of pain for pleasure. And as this final point says here, what all of the women who went through that process had in common was that they acknowledged that they had to unlearn mainstream power dynamics to understand and accept their own desires. Okay, so that term unlearning, we've talked about quite a few times this semester, right? What do you have to unlearn in order to learn about yourself? And for Danielle, as one of a few people who went through this long process, it was about, you know, unlearning mainstream power dynamics, right? That male is dominant, female is submissive, right? If you can unlearn the simplicity of that and understand your desire and your sexuality in a way that challenges the mainstream power dynamics and understands that power dynamics can be played out for fun and for sexual pleasure, right? That can sort of lead to an understanding and acceptance of one's own desire. So we're going to talk a little bit more about unlearning these mainstream power dynamics when we talk about 50 Shades of Grey. So I'll just end this lesson by reading this quote to you, because I think it sort of highlights the processes of thinking through and analyzing, justifying, you know, one's sexual interest with one's feminist politics. So Jane Gallup, she wrote this really interesting book called Jane Sexes It Up, and it's like, I think it's called like Jane Sexes It Up, True Confessions of Feminist Desire. And so she says, people who want to get rid of sexuality for the sake of their feminist politics, and people who want to get rid of feminism so they can feel good about sex and the sex that they're having, those people are choosing artificial comfort over the uneven path of conflict. So it's kind of a complicated quote, but I want to end with it just to sort of say it reiterates a lot of what the women in my research were going through, right? They had these desires and they thought, like, are these desires misaligned with my feminist politics? And if they are, do I have to get rid of one or the other? And Jane Gallup is saying, don't get rid of either, right? If you get rid of either, if you get rid of sexuality and your desires because you think that makes you a bad feminist, that's stupid. If you want to get rid of your feminist politics so that you can feel good about being submissive, that's also silly, right? She says that's choosing artificial comfort. And what she's saying is embrace both of those identities. Merge through that uneven path of conflict, right? Work through those identities because they can, of course, coexist. And as I showed you with Megan's example, happily so, she sees them as completely aligned. So I just like to sort of end with that quote, just to, again, sort of like really get you thinking about these two seemingly different but very similar identities.